in the previous part, we were talking about beyond birth, that is, what are the various factors that determined the resources distribution and status of a person. So beyond birth, like other than birth, the one important factor of receiving wealth was gender. So we have seen that in comparison to men, the women did not have access to as much resources, and this is one of the biggest reasons why women became more and more weak with time, in terms of society. And she did not have the resources to even fight for her own honor, and she started being used by men as their own property. She did not have any say on what kind of life she wanted. So this is how gender had started determining that who is going to lead what sort of life. But apart from that, we have already also studied the prospect of Stridhan, that Stridhan used to belong to the woman herself, and husband did not have any say for that. But even for that, to let her keep the Stridhan, the permission of husband was required. So this is all we read in the last part. And now, how could men and women acquire wealth? Now this is a blog that is given in your book, and here it states that Manusmriti has declared 7 means of acquiring wealth for men, and this is inheritance, of course, how what you inherit from your father, finding or purchase or conquest, you win a war, there is investment, you work, or the acceptance of gifts from good people. So these are the 7 ways of acquiring wealth. For women, it is a different story. There are 6 means of acquiring wealth for her. Whatever has been offered to her in front of the marriage fire, or as a bridal procession, or as a token of affection, or whatever property or gift she has received from her brother, mother, or father, or her husband. So these are the ways. Basically, she is receiving wealth from her loved ones, that is the most closest relations, that is mother, father, brother, and husband. So these are the various means of acquiring wealth for women. But for men, it is much more wider. They can wage wars, they can invest their monies in other prospects, they can work, they can have professions, they can inherit, which is again not available as an option for the women. So the next important, apart from gender, the next important factor that determined the access to property is obviously varnas. We have already seen that the society was divided into 4 varnas. The topmost point in the ladder is obviously Brahmins. After that is Kshatriyas. Following them are Vaishyas, and the last and the bottommost is Shudras. So Varnas also determine how much and what sort of wealth can be owned by a particular Varna. So the only occupation that was prescribed was Shudras, was servitude. We have already done that, that their responsibility, the function assigned to Shudras was that they had to serve the upper 3 Varnas. If these provisions were actually implemented, the wealthiest men would obviously be Brahmins and Kshatriyas. We have already seen that Brahmins and Kshatriyas, they had the the right to accept gifts from the lower varnas, and according to the various texts, it has been said that they used to receive various taxes, they used to receive properties from the lower varnas, they used to have so many ways of acquiring wealth. And so according to the religious scriptures, it is very clear that in the society, Brahmins and Kshatriyas were considered to be the most wealthiest, and this ought to be because they used to um, rule over the people, and the people had to give them various donations, etc., to preserve themselves in the society. So this is how they have been depicted in the texts also, that Brahmins and Kshatriyas ought to be the richest classes of the society. So at another level, there are other traditions also that developed critique against the Varna order. So when there is a certain rigid framework, there are always traditions which gather or muster courage to criticize that rigid framework. So one such um, attempt at challenging this structure was the rise of early Buddhism in the 6th century BCE. You already know Buddhism was started by Gautam Buddha. His real name was Siddharth. So we are going to read about that later. So Buddhists recognized these differences in the society and they found it quite unnatural because they started challenging that Brahmins were doing it for their own purposes. And the most important point here is that the person who started Buddhism, Gautam Buddha, he himself was a Kshatriya. So the Kshatriya themselves started to challenge the position of Brahmins in order for them to release them from their strangleholds of religious dependence. So the Kshatriyas themselves had started realizing that there were differences in the society which was creating conflicts in the society, which was pretty unnatural and was uncalled for. So they started rejecting the idea of claims to status on the basis of birth. So Buddhism can be attributed with all sorts of praise that it had rejected or criticized this idea that people have the status in the society based on which family they were being born to. So this is how critiques started pressurizing the Brahmins to change this rigid structure. Now, an alternate social scenario is the sharing of wealth. Now, based on the wealth, obviously, a person had a lot of command in the society. More the wealth a person possessed, higher was the position of that person is in the society. But it is not necessary that the person also commanded the same respect. Obviously, being strong and wealthy is going to earn you a lot of power in the society, but it is not necessary that you are going to earn the same kind of respect, that people truly respect you. So however, there were other possibilities as well. So situations where men who were generous were respected, while those who were miserly or simply accumulated wealth for themselves were despised. So people who used to behave in a greedy manner, who were not respectful towards other humans, so those peoples were secretly also disliked by the people, and there was a lot of indignation among the people against these rulers. While the rulers who used to be generous, who used to help the people, they were openly supported and respected by the people. One area where these values of sharing wealth was practiced is the ancient Tamilakam. Tamilakam, already told you, this is basically present day Tamil Nadu and some parts of Kerala and Andhra Pradesh. So the ancient Tamilakam, there were around 100 chiefdoms, and these chiefdoms used to have authority simultaneously, and they used to take decisions simultaneously. So these people, they were famous for their patronage towards the culture aspect of the society, that they used to give patronage to the bards and the poets, and therefore these bards and the poets, even though they were not rich, they used to, through their creations, through their poems, through their works of art, they used to praise these kings of Tamilakam because they were very generous, and they used to provide all sorts of help for these creative people to survive in the society. So poems included in the Tamil Sangam anthologies often illuminate social and economic relationships, suggesting that while there were differences between the rich and the poor, those who control resources were also expected to share them. That is, the people in the power, they were expected to share their wealth with the common masses, so that there is a little bit of equalization, plus there is a protection to the creative part of the society, that is the people who were related to literature or art, because they also decided how rich the culture of that time used to be. So this is how, this is an alternate social scenario. Alternate means that something which also existed at the same time when there was suppression of any sort of challenges in the society. Now next important topic is explaining social difference, a social contract. Now this is an idea which was pronounced by the Buddhist, and this was an alternative understanding of social inequality, how social inequality started. So according to Buddhism, there are three pitakas. Pitakas basically are books in Buddhism, and each pitaka has different information, set of information in them. So in a Sutta Pitaka, it is said that originally everything was equal, every human being was equal, everybody was living in peace with the nature, and there was no differences. But with the advancement of a person's thinking, people started using or exploiting nature to become more powerful. There was beginning of making of tools, there was killing of other creatures, etc. So with this increase in the greed, there was gradual deterioration in the state of how human beings were living in peace with the nature, and this led to a time when there was a lot of inequality and disturbance in the society. So the humans themselves decided among themselves that there has to be one person in command who can take all the important decisions relating to the society and try to be responsible for the security or protection of the society. So this is called a social contract. The people in the society are coming together and selecting a person from among themselves to be in authority and to control how the society works. And this one particular person, he can be called as a king also, but the traditional term was Mahasamtata, the great elect. That is a person who has been elected by the people, and in return the people are going to give him certain gifts or donations or proportions of the rights they have produced in their fields. So this suggests that the institution of kingship was based on human choice. जो institution kingship का है, ये जो king term है, this has not been imposed on us by anybody, rather it was us who started this institution in the past, so that there is much more peace and prosperity in the society. And for the king to work properly, we used to pay him taxes in the form of part of whatever we have produced, or in the form of the services that we used to render to the king. So it reveals the recognition of human agency, that is a human resource, how important it was to create stability in the society and to make the society more prosperous and peaceful. Now next subtopic is handling texts, historians and the Mahabharat. Now whatever texts that historians have found, there are certain things that the historians give more importance to, that those information, those particular factual details which are given more importance to by the historians, is basically first important point is the language. Whether the text has been written in Sanskrit, which is considered to be the language of the elites and the educated, or whether they were written in language which was a local language which could also be understood by the ordinary people. So the historians pay a lot of attention to the fact that whether this text has been written in the language of the commons or whether it has been written in the language of the elites. The second important point which historians pay attention to is which kind of text is it, whether it is a text which only comprises of chants and mantras or hymns, or whether it is a text which has stories. So stories are basically epics, it can be Mahabharata, etc., or hymns, the text can be a Ved. So this is the kind of text. So they also give attention to the fact that what kind of text it actually is, whether it is a compilation of the hymns altogether or whether it is a compilation of various stories altogether. Third important point is the historians try to find out about the author, what kind of author he is, whether he is uh, 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 whether he is an employee of the king, or whether he is doing his work with full freedom, because that again is going to tell the historians. If he is an employee of the king, then probably that author has written those texts keeping in mind that he wanted to flatter the king, so he might not have been 100% subjective while he was objective while he was writing the text. Next important point that historians keep in mind is what sort of audience that text is trying to deliver to, whether the audience is educated, whether it is illiterate, what kind of interest that audience has. So based on the audience also a particular text is written, and therefore historians attach a lot of importance to the fact that what kind of audience is that text catering to. The last important point the historians keep in mind is the possible date of composition or compilation of the text. So when they were compiled, so the dates are also very important, and only after assessment of all these points together, the historians come to the conclusion whether this is an historically significant text or not. So if it is a historically significant text, then that text is read in detail, otherwise it is not given much importance. So this was all for this part. See you in the next.